Well, hello everyone and welcome to tonight's Cap Times talk about redistricting in Wisconsin. I'm Chris Murphy, the managing editor. In just a minute, I'm going to turn it over to our host, Briana Reilly, to introduce our guests. But I wanted to take a moment first to thank our sponsor, Exact Sciences, as well as all the Cap Times members with us tonight. Your contributions are absolutely crucial for putting on events like this one, not to mention the reporting that we produce every day. Thank you. For those of you watching who aren't Cap Times members, you should know that membership comes with a number of benefits, including the option to pose questions to panelists at events like this one. Visit membership.captimes.com for more information about that. While I have you here, I want to make sure you knew that on June 17th, Lindsay Christians will be hosting another Cooking with the Cap Times with Suhey Beiser of Five Senses Palette. And then on July 13th will be our next Cap Times Live featuring Rob Dees and DJ Vilas Park Sniper with Opal Elise. They'll all be performing at the High Noon Saloon, but we'll be broadcasting that so that you can watch virtually. I'll post times and registration links for those events in the chat after we get started. Speaking of which, I'm going to turn it over now to Briana, who's our state government reporter here at the Cap Times. Great to see you, Briana.
Yeah, thanks for that intro, Chris. After a decade under GOP-drawn legislative boundaries that Democrats challenged as an illegal partisan gerrymander, Wisconsin is coming up on a redistricting process that's all but certain to end up in the courts once again, given the current state of divided government. Despite the fact that it'll be months until Wisconsin officials get the U.S. Census data they need to redraw legislative maps, there's been no shortage of redistricting news in recent weeks. The state is poised to keep its 8 U.S. House seats following a decennial survey. A Dane County judge voided Republican legislative leaders' contracts with redistricting attorneys and lawsuits. And earlier this month, the Wisconsin Supreme Court declined to set up a process to directly hear lawsuits over map drawing, though justices did not rule out taking original jurisdiction over individual cases. Tonight, our focus is largely on the months ahead, how officials will work to create boundaries under a very tight timeline going forward, what role Governor Tony Evers' People's Maps Commission will play in redistricting, and how Wisconsin compares to other states heading into this process. Joining me to discuss all of that and more, our Fair Elections Project director and co-founder, Sachin Chheda, a mathematician and Tufts University professor, Duchin, who runs the MGGG Redistricting Lab, and Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty President and General Counsel, Rick Esenberg. Thank you all so much for joining me. For those in the Zoom audience, I'll begin with a series of my own questions for the panelists, but if you want to ask something, please do type it in the chat or use the Q&A button. We have saved a ton of time for audience questions. We're anticipating quite a few about this process and this topic. So I will begin incorporating those around the halfway point of our discussion. But let's begin with my own and we'll go from there. First question goes to Sachin. Typically following a census, states get the federal data needed to redraw legislative and congressional district lines in the spring. This year, largely due to COVID-19, officials say complete data won't be available until the end of September. How does that delay shape the timeline we have here in Wisconsin to get new maps in place ahead of the 2022 cycle?
Well, thanks very much for the question, Briana, and thanks to you and the Cap Times for hosting this event. I'm glad to be on the panel with Rick and Moon, and looking forward to the conversation. So it definitely is going to be more compressed than usual, but Wisconsin has shown that we can do these things very quickly. In fact, if we look back 10 years ago, the legislative leadership, then Speaker Fitzgerald and then Majority Leader Fitzgerald, the two brothers, pushed the entire redistricting process through very, very, very quickly because they were afraid of losing the Senate majority in the recall elections in the spring of 2011, in the summer of 2011, and they ended up losing that majority for a very short time in the summer of 2012. And so they showed, even using a kind of corrupt, behind the locked door of a secret map room with secrecy agreements, like even using a process that was really shutting the public out, that they could do it really quickly. And so we think with a more transparent process, with kind of putting all the cards on the table as the process should be done, and the People's Maps Commission has definitely promised that they're going to do that, the cycle can be redistricted in time. So just to say two additional small things about that. One is, we understand from the Commerce Department, the Census Bureau, that data that they thought might be September 30th is now much more likely to be August 15th. So there's an extra 6 weeks that's built back if we get that block by block and demographic data on August 15th. There's also the question of, the spring election cycle needs new maps at the local level on December 1st, if they're going to stick to the timeline for a February primary and for for circulating signatures. The fall of 2022 doesn't need those maps in place until April 15th. That's when signatures would normally begin to be gathered. It really wouldn't be a big burden if that were even pushed to May 1st, because you have until June 1st to get people on the ballot for the August primary. And so at the end of the day, they have from August 15th all the way to April 15th for those fall districts. And if the legislature does what it should do, which is to kick the ball down to a bottom-up process, the way it historically has been done, let the municipalities draw ward lines very quickly in the fall, let them get some district lines in place so that they can get those December deadline met, and then kick it to the legislature to do the fall seats, the state legislative seats and the congressional seats, we should be okay. And they don't need the 60 days that's currently mandated kind of each step of the process. The Republicans proved that 10 years ago. So I think that although the process will be more compressed, it's something that can easily be done in the time that's been given, and we should do it in an open and honest and transparent way.
Thanks for taking that. Moon, I want to turn to you now just to zoom out a little bit in this discussion early on. The delay means some states, right, won't have the data in hand until after their own redistricting deadlines. It's possible other states may be faced with delaying their primaries if court fights are dragged out long enough. How do you see those impacts playing out nationally?
Great. Well, hi, I'm really happy to be here. I joined a minute or two late because of a power outage unexpectedly at my house, so I'm happy to be able to be in my office for the first time in a year and able to chat with y'all tonight. So yeah, about the data. So one thing, let me be kind of clear about my background and my roles. So I'm a math professor, been interested in redistricting, and it's kind of taken over my research program in the last 5 years or so. I run a lab that does data science for civil rights. We like to think of it as that's our niche. And so as a professor and a researcher, I'm really interested in redistricting and in the data that's used to make it happen. And in Wisconsin, I'm really thrilled to be advising the PMC, the People's Maps Commission, so that they can execute some of their ideas and criteria and do, just as you were just hearing from Sachin, a really kind of transparent process. So I'll be talking about that over the course of the night. So when it comes to the data, one thing to say is there have been a lot of rumors about what data is out when. And I think we now know we have a firm commitment from the Bureau to have data out in mid-August, as you heard, in a format that will be usable by anybody with a data team. So for all intents and purposes, the data is out in mid-August. It takes another 6 weeks or so for the Bureau to put together the kind of front-end tools for people to explore the data on their website, but the data is final and released in mid-August. And so to the question, like what's happening around the country and what is this doing to people's practices, I'll just say, if you are doing a bottom-up process, there's a lot you can do before the data's out. You can talk to communities, you can ask people the question, where do you live? What should we know about your neighborhood and your region? What's important about the process? And what are you looking for when it comes to redistricting? So all that kind of work can happen on this like long ramp over the summer while we're waiting for the data. And I think you're seeing that, I'm seeing that process kind of blossom in a lot of different states. If we get into it a little bit more, it'd be really interesting to talk over the course of the night about kind of what is that data? So we have data down to these tiny little units you heard about from Sachin called census blocks. So those can have no people in them. They can have 100 or 200 people in them. Very rarely they can be a lot bigger than that. So there's these kind of granular little pixels that people are accustomed to using as the building blocks for redistricting. So in this kind of wait period of a few months that we're in now, we have the top line state level numbers from the Bureau, because that's how they did the congressional apportionment to decide how many seats each state would get. But we're waiting for all the aggregate data down at that most granular level, which is the PL 94-171 release that's kind of statutorily required for redistricting purposes.
Thank you for getting into all of that. Rick, I want to turn to you now and sort of go back to Wisconsin specifically. With the technology we have now, physically drawing district lines doesn't take long. It's really the ensuing court fight over our maps where we could see the effects of this crunch timeline. Do you see any scenarios at this point? I know I'm asking you to speculate a little bit here, but a scenario where Wisconsin wouldn't have new maps ready to go? The state would have to keep its current 2011 drawn lines in place for the 2022 elections?
It could happen. It's not unprecedented, but I mean, it'll be difficult. I mean, I would agree with Sachin that there is physically enough time to do this, but I'm not sure. It becomes a little bit more challenging to think that there is enough time to attempt to do this and then litigate over the failure to reach some type of legislative solution. And, you know, who knows what's going to happen, but the conventional wisdom is going to be that the legislature will pass a set of maps. They'll do that, you know, in time. The governor will veto them, and then the matter will go into litigation. Lawyers being lawyers, there are probably going to be competing cases filed in competing forums. So there will be procedural wrangling to work that through. There are likely to be a number of interveners in each of these cases. You know, depending upon, you know, how it's handled. If it's in state court and the Supreme Court takes this as an original action, it could move more quickly. If they don't do it that way, it'll move more slowly. And I think the courts will get it done because they have to. I mean, we need to have new maps, but I think it's going to be, I think it's going to be a really compressed process that is likely to show the signs of being compressed in various ways. And it did in 2011, where, you know, I mean, there are a lot of things that, you know, if somebody would have asked me, I would have told the Republicans not to do, but I think they did it because, as Sachin points out, they did want to get this done relatively quickly. They wanted to get it. I think they wanted to get it done before the Senate recall elections in August 2011. They did not lose control of the body, but I suspect they were concerned that they would.
Yeah, I appreciate you getting into that. Sachin, this next question's for you, and I want to dive a little bit more into the court's role going forward, which, you know, Rick already sort of talked about. Just to rehash for people and really reiterate what Rick said, you know, in Wisconsin, maps are proposed by the legislature, they're passed as bills. What's almost certain to happen, as Rick mentioned, is GOP lawmakers who have the majority in both chambers will draw their lines. Governor Evers, a Democrat, will veto them. Republicans don't have the veto-proof majorities needed to override, so we end up in court, right? Can you talk about where redistricting fights are typically litigated and how the state Supreme Court's decision to reject the call to create a process for automatically hearing these cases factors into what could happen in the months ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. I think there's 3 points to be made here. So the first is that as a political observer, I would agree that based on the actions and behavior and the talking points that the Republican leadership and Speaker Voss and Leader LeMahieu have used, that it is likely that they're going to propose a biased, rigged map that will force Governor Evers into vetoing it. But let me just be clear that that's a choice. That's a political choice not to listen to the will of the voters, not to draw these maps in a transparent and open process with the intent or with the goal of coming to compromise with the Democratic governor who was elected by the people. In 1971, the parties were able to come to a consensus between the two parties and put it in front of the legislature, get it passed, get it signed by the governor, even though there was split control. And it is something that could happen and should happen in an honest and open system. In 1981, in 1991, 2001, the process went to the federal courts. In 2011, because there was one party control of the trifecta of the Assembly, the Senate, and the governor's office, it got litigated in federal courts afterwards, but the courts, the maps themselves were essentially ready to go once they'd been passed in the summer of 2011. And so the first thing is just to say that it's a choice, right? That there's a choice there. When it comes to the rule itself, I think the Supreme Court rejected this rule. And let me just be clear, I'm not a lawyer at all. And Rick is a Harvard-educated lawyer who edited the law review. And so I don't mean to suggest that I am more versed in the law than he. But as an observer, I'm one of those guys who's played a lawyer on TV a lot, especially around this issue. And I would say that my sense is that this proposed rule went too far for this Supreme Court, that it was so incredibly partisan and rigged in its proposal. And Rick can suggest why that wasn't the case. He was, I think, one of the people who brought it forward, but it was just too much for the court to accept. You have a couple of members of the current court who, I think it was 15 years ago or 13 years ago, said, we really don't want the state Supreme Court to do this. The federal courts have a long history of drawing maps, not only in Wisconsin, but in other states. They're better positioned to do this. There's a more established process to address concerns around racial gerrymandering and partisan gerrymandering and voting rights issues, et cetera. But I think the difference is that in Wisconsin today, and I'll talk about other states in a moment, but in Wisconsin today, you have one group of people who's essentially fighting for fair maps, even Democrats like me, who are not trying to rig the maps in favor of Democrats. You've got partisan folks on the right, Rick and his allies, who are trying to rig the maps for Republicans. They don't want fair maps. And then you have to have a process by which you kind of get through all that process. Now, in other states, Democrats are trying to rig the maps. In Illinois or Maryland or Massachusetts, that isn't the case here. In fact, there's never really been an example of the Democrats trying to rig the maps in Wisconsin in the modern political era. Maybe they would have had they had the power. They never had the power to do so either, to be fair. So I think that, look, federal courts know the deadlines. They know how to go through these processes. I think in the past, this has always gone to federal court in Wisconsin, and it is likely to do so again. There'll be folks who want to get it into the state Supreme Court because they think that's a better venue for the outcome they're seeking. But I think that it's much more likely that there will be kind of multiple cases brought forward and the final map will be implemented by a federal court.
Yeah, Rick, you want to go
say,
weigh in on that?
It is not the case that these maps have always been drawn by the federal courts. In fact, many times they've been drawn or adopted by the Wisconsin Supreme Court, oftentimes in an original action. The last time I think was the maps that were drawn in the 1960s. So it's not unprecedented. In addition, both the Wisconsin Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court have said that priority is not with federal courts with respect to the drawing of maps, but with state courts. And the rationale for that is under the United States Constitution, the drawing of these maps is a state legislative function. And so the argument to extend one step from that is that this would also be a matter for state court review, unless there's some federal question that then has to be reviewed once the state courts have acted upon it. More recently, when they've gone to court, they have been in federal court, but there's no legal reason that should be so. And in fact, as I said before, both the United States Supreme Court and Wisconsin Supreme Court have formally said the presumption is otherwise. With respect to the rule that was adopted, the reason that the rule was proposed is that the last time these maps went to litigation was after the 2000 census. There was a federal action filed. There was an action filed in state court by then Speaker of the Assembly, Scott Jensen. In that case, the court said, look, we understand that we actually are the court that should deal with this, but we can't deal it with it through an original action because we don't have a rule and a process in place in order to permit that to happen, but we will adopt one. In the late aughts, the court declined to adopt such a rule, ironically, with the more left-leaning justices wanting to adopt the rule and the more conservative-leaning justices not wanting to adopt the rule. We went back to them and asked them to fashion a rule. We made a suggestion. We also told them that there were many ways that they could do it, but what was key is that they needed to have, they didn't have to have it, but based upon their earlier remarks, we felt they wanted to have some type of fact-finding process where you could use referees or something like that, which is a fairly usual thing for the Supreme Court to do. It's how it handles attorney discipline cases. They decided not to adopt the rule. Someone may very well file litigation, an original action in the state Supreme Court, and they'll decide whether to take it or not to take it. It's up to them. They have the discretion.
can I just make one comment? And Rick, there's a lot of what you said there that I agree with. Absolutely, the state Supreme Court, prior to the 1971 redrawing, this was a very different process. But I just want to be very clear that it is a good idea to break history into the one person, one vote era, the 1971 drawing, and to today, and the pre-1971 era, when we didn't have a one person, one vote requirement from the U.S. Supreme Court, and redrawing happened in a very different process, right? It was very county line driven. We didn't have this kind of block by block attempt to rig the maps. Gerrymandering was a very different concept in those days, when we were using existing county and municipal lines kind of as exclusive barriers especially for state legislative districts. So that I hear you, but in the modern era, there's no example of the Wisconsin State Supreme Court drawing these lines and having them be the lines. That's the one thing I'll say. The second thing I'll say is that, look, I'm agnostic on the issue of whether or not there should be a rule. It's my view, and I think it's the view of a lot of observers, that had you and Will proposed a rule that wasn't so laughably biased in favor of an outcome that you wanted to achieve, that there may well have been a situation where a rule could have been adopted. But the effort was, let's elevate these parties, let's push down these parties and their ability to have a voice. Let's try to make our conservative allies on the Supreme Court get what they want. And I think when even that was a bridge too far for then Chief Justice Roggensack and for Justice Ziegler, and so then you get to this unanimous court that says, well, let's just punt again, even though 12, 13, 14 years ago they said we really should adopt the rule. It goes to show how much effort there is. There's an intent question about why and how the right wing in this state is trying to rig the maps, the way that Speaker Madigan wants to rig the maps in Illinois, or the way that the Democrats in Maryland want to rig the maps. And frankly, I think people of both parties, good-willed people in both states, Republicans in Illinois and Republicans in Maryland and Democrats in Wisconsin, say, come on, stop. Let's stop trying to rig the process and let's get a process that's more fair. And I think that might lead us to the next question, which is, what are some processes we could use that are more fair?
With all due respect, that's very formulaic, but the rule that we proposed excluded absolutely no one. In fact, we told the court that they could let anybody in, and they actually should let almost everybody in, because that's the nature of redistricting litigation.
All right, I'm going to move on to the question of what a quote unquote nonpartisan, non-legislative commission, citizen-led process looks like in other states, and how other states have sort of created that. Moon, can you speak to that? How does redistricting play out in states that have those processes in place?
Sure, absolutely. But I think also we're in a moment of a transition on that level. So I'll say there certainly have been bodies other than legislatures that have been drawing. Notably, Arizona and California formed independent commissions in somewhat different models. This is a much smaller commission in Arizona with people from the parties balanced out, and then one independent who was sort of in the middle of it all. A 14-member commission in California with a really robust process of applications that put college essays to shame, and then lottery element and just a very elaborate process. The goal being to seat a diverse commission that would have people from kind of all walks of life and be a sort of miniature of the state. It's a little hard to do for California in just 14 people, but that's the idea. In 2018, 5 states had their voters approve at the ballot box a reform to redistricting, 4 constitutional amendments and 1 statutory change. And those states were of all stripes. You had Ohio and Michigan, Missouri, Colorado, and Utah, right? And then independent commissions were established in different ways in these states. Virginia followed with its elaborate constitutional amendment process a little bit later. And then there's a bit of a kind of pullback the other way in Missouri and in Utah, where the people of those states or the legislature kind of negated the newly formed commission in some sense. But we're going to have more commissions than ever before in American history this time. And they're really kind of doing that laboratories of democracy thing. So it'll look a little different in each of these states and many more. So in addition to those, there are states like Wisconsin, where in this case, the governor set up a People's Commission by executive order. There are public parallel processes emerging in a lot of other states. For instance, in Ohio, the commission that was approved in 2018 is a politician commission, and so there will be a citizen commission kind of working alongside it. So how might you expect that work to look different, or what are the different places doing? Well, one thing that each and every one of these commissions is taking very seriously, as I mentioned before, is input from the public. That's kind of right in the middle of the workflow for all of these different bodies as I see them forming around the country. And, conventionally, there are hearings around the time of redistricting. And at those hearings, people can come to the mic and they can talk about their community, they can talk about the process. And then typically when a new plan is available for the public to look at, there'll be a period for public commentary. So one of the biggest differences that I see happening in a lot of these commission processes around the country is putting mechanisms in place to take the public input and make it actionable. I think that's really fundamental. California gave us one model of how to do that in the last cycle, a very particular model that I don't think anywhere else will emulate quite exactly. What they did was they had all of these hearings live and live streamed, and available for the public to watch. And then they drew live and live streamed. So they actually drew the lines in real time with people shouting out a little to the left, a little to the right. I'm only exaggerating slightly. So it was extreme transparency was the California model. And there's a lot to say for that. When you're not all the way over at that extreme, what might it look like to have a process, to have mechanisms for taking this kind of public input into account? One thing that it looks like is articulating criteria. In some of these places, for instance, in Michigan, the criteria are actually named and rank ordered in the Constitution now. And so the commission is bound to that list and that rank order. And in other places, there's just, deliberative democracy in action, really, as the people on the commissions talk through what it might look like to do, to sort of take traditional redistricting criteria and operationalize them in different ways. So I could go on. There's so much interesting that's happening around the country, but I think I've identified two of the ways that the commission process looks a little different, at least from the outside, to the public, looks quite different from the traditional legislature-led process, and that is public input early and often with a mechanism for how to use it, and a kind of surfacing of criteria and the ways of making them concrete early in the process so that the maps can be judged by the articulated criteria.
Thank you for getting into that. I know it was a very broad question, so I appreciate you tackling it fearlessly. I'm going to pose one more question to Rick, and then I'll start incorporating some audience questions just to sort of wrap up, for now, this discussion about Governor Evers' own People's Maps Commission. Obviously they're involved this time. It's a very big differentiator in the process. Members of the citizen body will take public input and draw their own maps, which Democrats could then, introduce as a bill in the legislature, though that would likely be ignored. But where these lines could really come into play is during the litigation process. Rick, can you sort of describe for us how the commission's work, could come into play then and influence the process this time around?
Well, I think that I think that they will participate in the process most likely as a litigant. There will be, what is likely to happen in some way is the legislature will draw its maps. Everybody thinks that, at least with respect to the legislative maps, that the governor will veto them. It's actually quite possible that, that the members of Congress will kind of reach a deal among themselves, and that will be less controversial. But let's assume that the way everybody thinks it's going to play out plays itself out. The governor vetoes, legislature, there will be then litigation somewhere. The legislature will go in and they'll say, here are the maps that we drew. We believe that we're the body with constitutional authority to do this, and you ought to accept our maps. And other people will come in, and one would presume that the governor, this is his commission, that he would want some maps or some map drawn by the commission to be offered as an alternative to the map advanced by the legislature. There are likely to be other groups who participate in the litigation as well. Some may have their own entirely different set of maps. Some may want the maps proposed by the legislature or the governor's commission to be tweaked in some way. And the court will have to sort that out in some way. And there are lots of interesting ways they can do it. I think, I don't know if it was 2000 or 1990, but one time recently, the Seventh Circuit announced, or not the Seventh Circuit, but the 3-judge panel announced that what it would do is it would adopt one of the maps submitted by the litigants, which was a really interesting ploy if you think about it, because they're basically saying to them, look, do whatever you want, but you get too greedy and you might not get what you want because we're going to pick from one of these. Now, in the end, they didn't do that, but it'll be interesting to see if something like that happens this time around.
Can I make just one quick comment before we go to a question to the audience? One thing I want to say, obviously I see that there's lots of, current events in Wisconsin kind of afoot in this conversation, but just one little point in terms of calling it the Governor's Commission. I can just say from my experience working with the commission so far, which has been really a pleasure and quite, extensive that I'm working with them, that I would think of the commission as established by the governor, but not the Governor's Commission per se. It really has members of the commission from all over the state who are just absolutely engaged in the project of coming up with a more transparent process. And so I just wanted to put that word in there, that I know it's easy to slip from commission established by the governor to Governor's Commission, but I really do see a kind of separation there in practice.
I appreciate you weighing in on that. We have quite a few audience questions already coming in, so I'm going to start incorporating them. I think this one, I'll start with this one just because it's sort of relevant to the topic we've been discussing. One audience member says, many individuals feel like there isn't a way to influence this process. Obviously, since the fall, the People's Maps Commission has been holding public virtual hearings in each of the state's congressional districts to sort of learn about the process of redrawing maps and hear from experts and also hear from individuals about communities of interest and things like that. But this listener is worried that the time to testify seems to have passed, and they're curious what the best way is for individuals to have an impact. I'm not sure if Sachin or Moon, you want to take that.
Go ahead, Moon, if you want to start, and then I've got a couple things I want to say about it.
Sure, I'll be brief. I'll say that the PMC is certainly taking testimony, submissions, all kinds of feedback all through the summer. And so I'm about to drop in the chat a link to ways to contribute on the PMC's page. Let's see if I can send this to everyone. Yes, I think I can. And a second generation submission portal for that will be up within a couple days. We're putting the finishing touches on a really snazzy looking second generation portal. So to that, I'd say I mentioned that the public submission process, the public comment process looks really different than it did even 10 years ago. And so one of the novel elements this time around is that there's a lot more free and easy to use software for taking whatever it is you want to say and attaching it to a map. So you can draw an area that you want to talk about the importance of, the lines in, and attach your narrative to spatial data in a way that's enormously helpful to the folks like me who want to synthesize all of that into something that's really actionable. I keep coming back to that. It's one thing to take input, and it's another thing to figure out how to use it. And so folks like me and my lab and many other groups around the country are really making a big kind of data science push to assist the transformation of data from narrative into, lines and regions and spatial data that mappers can look at, and that'll be available throughout the process.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just really, I spend a lot of time talking about what happened 10 years ago, and I hope that doesn't get boring for people, but it was such an incredibly corrupt process. And, whether we're talking about smashed hard drives that had to be, you had to like get a data person to scrape out the data from that, hundreds of thousands of dollars to show what the legislative leadership did, the secret map room and the high price consultants. And, consultant under oath admitted their goal was to rig the maps for the next decade, right? Like they went to federal court and they said, that's what we were trying to do. There were these secrecy agreements where legislators weren't allowed to share what they learned about the maps in public. So there was no public engagement until the pro forma hearing, you know, the few days before they passed the maps into law after all the drawing work had been done. It was completely kind of shameful. Even a former Republican Senate Majority Leader said that it's a total corruption of democracy. You know, the millions of dollars spent on lawyers. And so when you compare and contrast that to the People's Maps Commission, which is like there were 8 public hearings that were on Zoom because of COVID. They intended to be in person, but they had to do them on Zoom. Now you can go on the website, you can submit written comments, you can actually draw a map, like using the software that's publicly available and free, that you just go in and you draw the map. Here's what should happen in my community. And then when you submit that map, it doesn't go into some secret cache or cache, right? It literally gets posted to the website. So it's totally transparent in a way that is a 100%, 180-degree contrast with the way the leadership did it. And the People's Maps Commission itself, as I understand it, you know, Rick made a nice attempt there to brand it as the governor's commission. It's the People's Maps Commission. The governor appointed judges, retired judges, I think, and then the retired judges picked citizens, and those citizens are Republicans, independents, and Democrats. They're not party activists, as far as I know. I mean, I don't know all of them personally. I know one of them's a big Republican, right? And so they've said, we want to do all this out in public so you can judge it. So I love the idea that Rick put forward, which is that, you know, the court hopefully will just ask for submissions. I don't think the People's Maps Commission would be a litigant. I think what will happen is citizens will say, here's the map you should choose. And because it was built in a transparent process, because there's no intent to rig it for one side or the other, it will be kind of, my guess is, the best choice, right? And I'm confident in the process, not because I know what the end result is going to be, but because I know that when we trust the people to do things in a transparent and open and honest way, that we're going to get a good result. And when we go into secret map rooms and we attempt to rig the process and we have partisan intent, then we get a bad result. And that's a really easy contrast for the people, I think, to see.
All right, I'll move on to one other question from the audience as I'm sort of sifting through the others here. One is also sort of about other states and what they're doing in terms of either nonpartisan redistricting models or citizen-led committees or things like that. You know, frequently the Iowa model for redistricting is held up as, especially among nonpartisan map drawing advocates, for its approach to drawing state and federal lines. I think since 1980, districts have been drawn by nonpartisan legislative staff, so government bureaucrats, as part of a statutory process that's unique nationally, right? For those on this panel who, you know, have obviously been paying attention to these issues much more than I have, first of all, how would you critique this model? And then this audience question was, is it a model that folks who are in favor of a nonpartisan approach think officials can and should apply to Wisconsin?
I have a few thoughts. Do other folks also want to weigh in? Okay, I'll get started anyway. Yeah, so I think there's a few interesting questions related to Iowa and generalizing. And so one is when you stand up a commission of citizens who aren't redistricting pros, there's a big gap between what they come to the table with and the skills they'll ultimately need to sort of design and select a map at the end. So there's a gap in knowledge and there's a gap in sort of hands-on skills. And in the different places where I've been observing the evolution of the process, it is frequently the case that there's legislative staff who help to bridge that gap. You know, I've gotten a closer up look so far at how that looks in a few other places, not directly in Iowa, but that's a part of the model that I'm really interested in. So for instance, in Michigan, there's a new Citizens Redistricting Commission, but the Michigan Department of State, MDOS, is staffing and assisting and kind of bringing their expertise into the mix and sort of helping, you know, get things from concept to execution, right? So I think legislative staff that's a big category of people with a great deal of redistricting knowledge. I've sort of gotten to experience that a little bit at NCSL, which I always get this acronym a little wrong, but I think it stands for the National Conference of State Legislatures. But they do regular redistricting meetings to keep redistricting staff who touch the redistricting process from all over the country and from all, both sides of the aisle and beyond, to sort of understand what best practices are in what's an increasingly technical area, right? And so one thing to say is that having a kind of staff with a deeper history of working in redistricting specifically can be the difference between, in institutional terms, between a commission succeeding and failing. So that's my comment on the Iowa model.
Sachin, do you have any thoughts on that? Or Rick, if you want to weigh in, obviously as part of this discussion about, potentially adopting a, quote unquote, nonpartisan redistricting model here in Wisconsin. I've heard the Iowa model being thrown out repeatedly in past sessions and pointed to as something we should look at.
Yeah, so let me just say that the Fair Maps Coalition, which I'm the chair of, absolutely advocates for the Wisconsin version of the Iowa Maps model. There's a couple of tiny tweaks we make to the process. And we think that's what the legislature should adopt. And the point is that they should take it out of the hands of politicians and put it in the hands of nonpartisan staff and kind of put politicians in a little bit of a box to accept a drawing that isn't intended to advantage one side or the other. And that's what we think they should do. It doesn't seem like the current legislative leadership wants to go in that direction, but that's what we absolutely advocate should happen.
I mean, look, I would say that I'm agnostic on the subject of commissions, but I have a concern about commissions, whether they are in this area or in the area of judicial selection, in that to the extent that they are predicated upon a presumption that what is intrinsically a partisan process can be made nonpartisan. It can't be. You can, and this will happen no matter how transparent you try to be, obfuscate partisan motivations, but they still will be there. So when we talk about redistricting criteria, the problem with redistricting criteria has always been that they're often at odds with one another. I mean, respecting political subdivisions is a redistricting criteria. Respecting communities of interest is a redistricting criteria, but oftentimes those two things will conflict with one another because communities of interest will not necessarily correspond to political subdivisions. There's a problem with respect to defining what communities of interest are. Some people, for example, conflate them with being in the same political subdivision, but those who live there may not see it that way. And in fact, those who live within a particular community may have quite different affinities or senses about who it is that shares their interest. Is core retention an interest that should be respected in the redistricting process? Should incumbency protection be protected? Some people say that it ought to be for reasons that I'm not sure how persuaded I am by them, but I think they're quite defensible. And so the problem that all of these things require value judgments, and that's really why the Supreme Court decided that reaffirmed the fact, something that had really been the case for 50 years, that it would not entertain claims of partisan gerrymandering because it could conceive of no judicially cognizable neutral principles that would allow it to, distinguish between what was a partisan gerrymander and what was a nonpartisan gerrymander. And so we're left with what we have. And I think in this instance, there will be a bunch of people that will propose maps. I think that at the end of the day, there'll be a relatively robust debate about the pros and cons of those various maps. And in this instance, the court, either the federal courts or ultimately the state Supreme Court, will decide.
We got one pretty good step back question from an audience member. And I think as we've gotten sort of both in the weeds and then zoomed out to the national level, we might have missed some things for just your typical Wisconsinite trying to understand the process. So I'm going to pose this to each of you. Feel free to jump in with an answer or characterization. But this audience member wrote, could one of you characterize the current process used by the legislature to draw maps? Who is doing it? Where are they located? Whether are they being paid? What appropriation is being used to accomplish this? When will we be able to see the product and react to it? Let's just sort of take a step back and describe for people what this process looks like and what we expect to see from the legislative drawn maps in the coming months?
I mean, Rick, you're closest to these guys. What are they doing right now?
I have nothing to do with it. I was not involved in drawing maps in 2011. I recall testifying at the hearing that, in my view, there would not be 5 votes on the United States Supreme Court to retreat from what it had been its practice for 40 years of not entertaining claims of partisan gerrymandering. In the end, I was right about that. That is, I have some views about the degree to which a concern about the drawing maps in a way that the proportionality of aggregate state votes for partisan candidates ought to match the composition of the legislature. I think that is inherently a partisan process. I mean, there's nothing less partisan about that than a process in which that isn't the case, given the fact that we use geographic first past the post districts in the state of Wisconsin. But in terms of what the legislature does, look, there were a lot of things that if you would have asked me, I would have told them not to do in 2011. But I'm also cognizant of the fact and humble enough to admit that I have never been a legislator and I have never worked for a legislator. And it is a very, very different process than the one that I'm used to, which is you go to court, everything is transparent, and decisions are made, hopefully, based upon the application of neutral principles in which some type of result is reasoned to. Legislative process doesn't work like that. It's one big compromise. It's 100 butterfly wings beating for 100 different reasons. And the outcome doesn't necessarily express the will of anyone. It is a process which is messy. We can go and find all the old sayings about watching sausage being made and that type of thing. But I think that those things are said because it's very difficult to avoid that in the legislative process. And so I try not to be overly critical about things that I don't know anything about and haven't been involved in.
Well, let me say this. I've never been a legislator either, but I have zero compunction about being deeply critical of the process that has been used in Wisconsin and the process that I think we can see that they want to use this year. And just to be clear, Rick, in 2011, I hear you saying that you weren't a part of the process of the drawing process, but you were one of the very few people invited to testify at the one hearing that they had prior to passing the maps, and you said Act 43 was entirely constitutional. It complied with all state and federal requirements, including the Voting Rights Act. I mean, you definitely favored and you testified in favor of the adoption of Act 43. I mean, that's what the record shows.
I said that the act could not be successfully challenged as a partisan gerrymander. The act was not successfully challenged as a partisan gerrymander.
Okay. Let's not relitigate 2011. The courts have done that. We can move on.
Briana, which is let me ask the question that you asked, which is what is happening now. So let's just be clear. We don't have a legislature today in which we have 100 butterflies all kind of speaking their voice. We have a legislature in which the party leaders hold complete and total sway over their caucuses. That is true for the Republican Party. That is true for the Democratic Party. All of the moderates have been driven out of both caucuses because partisan primaries hold sway on a gerrymandered map. We have 80%, 90% of the vote that go to Democrats in their districts, 65%, 60%, 70% that go to the vote in the Republican districts, 2 or 3 districts in the middle that have moved. We've had 3 incumbents total that have been defeated in Wisconsin in the last 4 elections. That's never happened before in the state. And so what we have is a legislative leadership driven process. And so to answer the question that was asked is you have leaders deciding what they're going to do, and they're not telling anybody. Robin Vos hasn't said, Devin LeMahieu hasn't said, here is the process that we're going to use. The People's Maps Commission has publicly said, here is the process that we're going to use. The Democrats have said, we're not really doing anything, right? Like, I mean, we should go ask them. And I think that I would point, Briana, to you and your colleagues in the Capitol newsroom to say, hey, why aren't we asking this question of those leaders every single day? What is the process that you're going to use? How transparent is it going to be? Are you going to put your work product on the website the way that the People's Maps Commission did? Because what happened 10 years ago is the only thing that we've got, right? And the same staff that were there 10 years ago that testified in the Whitford case are still working for these folks. The same consultants, former Representative Handrick and others, are still engaged in the process with these leaders, with Voss and LeMahieu. And so I would put the question to them, are you going to do anything different? Because, you know, you signed a contract for $200,000 a month with a lawyer saying, let's litigate, let's litigate, let's litigate, but there isn't anything being put forward, not one word about the process that they're actually going to use to engage the public and to listen to public input, other than a pro forma hearing at the end of the process. And that's, I think, the question that all of the people of Wisconsin, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, want to know is, how do we get engaged, right? How do we actually have our voice heard with a legislature that doesn't want to listen on issue after issue after issue?
Yeah, so if I could jump in, I would say Rick raised one point that I wanted to clarify or amplify, which is we may not know what's happening on the legislative side, but the PMC has kind of published its criteria. And one of them, I think very low ranked on the list near the bottom, is a partisan balance criterion that Rick mentioned, which is among maps that equally well satisfy all the higher ranked criteria, favor ones that perform proportionally. And I think that I've been hearing a lot of questions about what that means. So I just thought I'd take a minute to just clarify the content of that. And I'll be brief, but I think it's an interesting suggestion. And as far as I know, looking around nationally, the only other place that has a proportionality preference written into the rules is Ohio, where that was part of the 2018 constitutional amendment that said you should prefer maps that tend to proportionality. So what does that mean? Just really briefly, I think there's two ways that the public looks at the situation and decides there may be a gerrymander afoot. There's two main like public intuitions about it. And one of them is ugly shaped districts. And the other one is big disproportions, meaning that one party gets a certain share of the vote statewide and a very different share of the representation. So maybe with 50% of the vote, you're getting 75% of the representation, something like that. That's what you'd call a deviation from proportionality. Proportionality is the idea that your vote share should be roughly equal to your seat share. Now there's other ideas out there, lots of others. For instance, in your last cycle in the litigation, the efficiency gap was one that was talked about a lot, which is just a different prescription for how vote share might relate to seat share. So there are these different ideas out there. What I like about just naming a criterion, such as, hey, you know, among maps that do a good job at all the other things, we're going to like the ones that when you lay them over recent voting patterns, they give you a proportional outcome. I'm not saying what I like about the criterion. I'm saying what I like about naming your criteria is that's at the heart of a transparent process. You say what it is that you'll use to judge what might make one map preferable to another. And then someone like me, I can come along, I'm the sort of in a support role here as a data science person. I can sort of help them make that wish into something achievable by building maps and sort of looking at how the maps are put together to understand what it would take to live up to those roles. So just to say, I think to the contrast between the legislative process and a commission process, that's a great example, is instead of leaving kind of the partisan principles, selection principles, unknown or unstated or just guessed or inferred, laying them out so that you can judge whether a map does a good job by the lights of that rule.
Well, I think you'll be happy, though, the way that the courts address this, because the courts will address this more in that way, because they're not a legislature. I mean, a legislature doesn't have to make an opinion that it can base its decision on an opinion that it can explain, because the legislature doesn't act with one voice. It's an aggregation of votes. You know, the problem with the proportionality, and I mean, the challenge that we have is that it itself embeds a number of substantive presumptions about what a proper outcome should be. I used to teach election law at Marquette University Law School, and one of the first things you do when you get to redistricting, you do the typical law professor thing. And so the first thing you do is you put up slides of these really ridiculous looking maps that have been drawn around the country, because the law students will laugh at that, and you can make jokes, and that's fun. The second thing you do is you show how usually, through some type of really simplistic maps with stars and circles on it, that outcome can change dramatically based upon where the stars and circles are located within the jurisdiction. And, there's been a lot written, if you talk about Bill Bishop's book, The Big Sort, that voters with preferences for Democratic and Republican candidates they are not similar in their level of geographic concentration, and that creates all sorts of problems. The Democrats, and it could differ in different states, but in Wisconsin it certainly is that way. Democrats complain that this creates something that they may call lack of proportionality or an efficiency gap, and all of these things are really measures of these differences in concentration. And the notion that you should remedy that is a substantive, and I think intrinsically partisan argument. I don't think there's any objective way to reason your way through that.
Well, just to respond to that, the good news from my point of view is, so I'm an expert in the math that you were just talking about. In other words, in understanding how the spatial distribution of preferences can convert to representational possibilities. That's been a total joy to study for the last few years. And so you're absolutely right that the political geography has some controlling effect on the world of possibilities. But I think what you see in a lot of these cases is maps that push all the way to what you might call the far side of the bell curve, and that take whatever the sort of tilting of the playing field is that comes from political geography and just push it until you're out kind of the invisible tails of the world of possibility. So your point is well taken. Political geography is real, and where people live has some impact on what you can accomplish when you redistrict. But the beautiful thing about stating your principles, and you're quite right, you can't objectively pick the best principle, but you can state a principle and then try to uphold it. And that's a really great model for transparent redistricting.
Yeah, which is the opposite. I think Professor Duchin would agree with what happened in this state 10 years ago, which Briana doesn't want me to talk about. So let me just say this about. Look, this was tested in federal court. There were people under oath. There were reports filed. There were experts who testified under oath, and it was very clear that the political geography of Wisconsin doesn't even come close. It doesn't. It's not even in the ballpark. Where it's like you hit a ball in Miller Park or in American Family Field in Wisconsin, and you catch it in the outfield where the Mallards play in Madison, to get to the level of political manipulation and rigging that's happened with the political geography. The idea that Democrats simply cannot win a majority because they're just packed into these cities. Let's just go through some very simple facts. This is a very simple story to tell. In 2008. The Democrats won majorities in both houses of the legislature and both houses of Congress. They had a Democratic governor. In 2010, the Republicans won majorities in both houses of the legislature, and they won the governor's office. In 2012, the Democrats got basically the same distribution of votes and the same distribution of winning margins in 2012 that they did in 2008, slightly less. And they didn't pick up a single seat in the assembly. So you're going to tell me in 4 years, Rick, you'd be lying to say that all of those people moved in Wisconsin from this district to that district, and that suddenly the Democrats can't pick up more than 39 seats. It's a lie. It's not a falsehood. It's a lie. And Robin Voss says it all the time, and he's lying. It is not because the candidates aren't good enough. It's because the map is rigged. Period. And everyone acknowledges that when they're being objective about it. Judge Ripple, appointed by Reagan, a contemporary of Scalia, a right-wing constitutional law professor at Notre Dame, wrote a decision in which he said, none of this is justifiable by any constitutional principle. It undermines the the democratic rights of Democratic voters in Wisconsin. Sure, politically, SCOTUS punted. You were right about that because Kennedy punted and then Kavanaugh got appointed. I get it. Like, you won a political fight at SCOTUS. But the facts are the facts. This map is rigged. And the only way to answer that is that it was intentionally rigged by Republican leadership in 2011, the same way that Speaker Madigan rigged the maps in Illinois and the same way the Democrats rigged the maps in Maryland. And I know whose side I'm on. I'm not on the side of Speaker Madigan. I'm not on the side of the folks who want to rig the maps in Maryland or New Jersey or Massachusetts. I'm in favor of people who say the politicians shouldn't draw the maps. They shouldn't let the maps be decided by people who want to keep their jobs. They should let the maps reflect the will of the people, and that's what we're fighting for, and that's what that's what you're fighting against. I mean, that's just the reality that we're at.
I'm not fighting for anything in particular, but I look, I don't think I'm as smart as you are. I don't think that I have the capacity to call other people liars or corrupt. But I will just point out to you that the outcome, and Judge Ripple got reversed, and the decision that the United States Supreme Court ultimately came for, it wasn't an outlier. It didn't happen because Brett Kavanaugh got appointed to the Supreme Court. That's the way that the court had been handling these cases for 50 years. And I would suggest,
it was a 5-4 decision.
Suggest to you to go back and read those cases, and you might understand that there's a reason for it.
Well,
Sure,
I
but
have
it was
loved
5-4,
watching
right?
this. Okay. Well, I've loved watching all of this play out. It's been so enjoyable. I want to get to an ending question just because, we foolishly committed ourselves to an hour, even though this is clearly a conversation that needs at least 2, maybe 3 to 4, and at least some alcohol, if not, a little bit more than that. But so I want to end by posing the same question to all of you, just so that folks in the audience can know what to keep an eye out for in the months ahead, right? What are you watching for on the redistricting front here in Wisconsin, going forward into the fall, into next spring? What should we all be keeping an eye out for? Rick, feel free to start.
Well, I mean, look, I assume that the action is going to begin when the litigation begins, and what I think one thing that will have to get sorted out is this going to be in state court? Is it going to be in federal court? If it's going to be in federal court, who's going to be on the panel? Right, the panel is appointed by the chief judge of the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, and I think that and at that point, then the question is, who becomes the litigants in that process? And again, I think that there will be a number of them. There always are. There always should be. And I think it'll be a very compacted and very interesting process. And I think it'll yield a fascinating judicial decision. But then again, I'm a lawyer wonk, so.
My short answer to that would be that there is going to be tons of litigation. I think that Rick is right. There's going to be litigation in state court and federal court. There's going to be competing cases and all kinds of, it's not going to be two sides, right? There's going to be all different kinds of sides and people who are filing cases and taking positions and trying to get what they want, whether that's a rigged Democratic map or a rigged Republican map or a fair map. I think what I would encourage people to do is get engaged the way the People's Maps Commission is asking you to get engaged, right? Which is to say, go on that website, submit a communities of interest map, tell a story about how your own community is well represented in the legislature or is not well represented. The historical lines in many, many cases were thrown out in the 2011 redrawing. Communities that previously had been together were divided and vice versa. And historical, you have counties that are split into 4 assembly districts that used to have 1. And, all these things have happened. And I think that the People's Maps Commission really honestly wants to hear, how is that working as a representational tool? Do these maps reflect communities and neighborhoods and people who are together or should be kind of separated into different buckets? And the more you engage in that process, the more they'll be working from a set of data that truly reflects the will of the people of Wisconsin. And so that engagement is deeply important. And I'd really push people to go to that link that Moon posted earlier. You can get to it from the fairmapswi.com page as well and submit a map and be engaged.
Yeah, that's great. I would just add to that, what I'll be looking for is, well, I think there's some really interesting work ahead in that several fold. One element is thinking about how to take all these things we've talked about into account at the same time. And the kind of the world of possibility that that the map makers are facing is vast and complicated, but is better understood. We have better tools for understanding what's possible, kind of what would happen if you let the chips fall where they may, how to live up to what, as Rick said earlier, and I completely agree, are sometimes vague and sometimes intention criteria, right? So you have here an interesting democratic challenge, an interesting human challenge, and an interesting technical challenge. And so the thing that I'll be excited to be involved in, but also excited to watch, is how to bring those together and how they can play out in, in making new maps for Wisconsin.
Thanks all. Lots to look out for in the months ahead. Great to have a sort of an idea of what to keep an eye on it as that process unfolds. And thank you all so much for this very fiery and informative discussion. Also, a big thanks to everyone who tuned in. Keep an eye out on the Cap Times website for more redistricting coverage as this process unfolds. And please don't hesitate to reach out to me or at least Sachin. I know that you've posted your email address in the Zoom chat with any additional redistricting related questions. I think we're good. Chris, is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, I think we're all set, Briana.
All right, thanks everyone. And for the question about and where to see this discussion, it has been live streamed on Facebook. So if you go to our Facebook page, you'll be able to replay this very informative, enlightening video as many times as you'd like. Thanks everyone again, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.